In the port city, Lith, a flock of birds was seen circling the city sky and ships that were docked. A bird that was perched on a log then saw the silhouette of an approaching ship. The bird then flew up to avoid it. On the ship, there was a young man. Seeing the port city in front of him, the young man then shouted happily because he finally arrived here. The young man then saw the activities being carried out by the residents there. There was a rabbit-eared girl who offered a potion to someone if he helped her. There was also a burly man who was selling his catch of fish. Seeing the busyness of the city, the young man's eyes then lit up. Seeing the joy of the young man, a dark-skinned young man then embraced the young man named Raymond. He also asked if he was that happy. The dark-skinned young man named Walker, hearing his question, Raymond then asked he must be equally happy, right? Seeing the interaction of the two of them, a fat man named Terran said, to be honest, he also wanted to run because he also felt happy. The girl behind him seemed to feel the same way. Terran then looked up and said, this is where their adventure begins. There is a towering building standing in the center of the city. This is the era of adventure, where adventurers from all over the world create their own adventures and become heroes in their own stories. Gates, the scenery after passing through the mysterious portal that began to appear all over the world one day is all kinds of terrible monsters that you can't see in the Maple world. Adventurers who died at the gate are countless. But there are many very valuable and powerful items that are inside the gates, that attracts those who dare to dream big. As they gathered, Walker then said that they needed bait. Raymond could only be confused to hear that. Walker explained, they couldn't plan anything until they knew what was inside the gate. Many adventurers died due to unexpected variables, that's why they needed slaves to act as bait. Hearing that, the girl agreed. She felt it was a good idea. They needed someone to distract from them when they escaped. That's why they were currently visiting the slave market. The caged slaves just stared at them blankly. The slave trader then welcomed them, and said this market was run by the Gaffer Merchant Union. All the people here were slaves used as bait. So he then invited them to choose. He also said that they would see that the slaves were worth the price. While pointing to one of the cells, the slave trader then said that he recommended these people. Their shape was good, they got them recently. Hearing that, Walker then said that he would take them both. The slave trader was then happy to hear that. He also wished, good luck on your adventure. After buying the slaves, they then headed to the gate. Before entering, Walker then said, they would mark the pillar here to let others know that they were here. He also felt that there seemed to be no one in here, that meant they would be the first. Smiling, Walker then asked them if they were ready. Hearing that, they then both invited him to enter. When they arrived inside, they were then presented with a view of an unfamiliar environment, and when Raymond came out of the gate, he really felt very strange. But when he looked towards the front, he was then shocked and amazed. When he saw a lot of giant mushrooms that had a size far exceeding human size, as well as many mysterious plants that he had never seen before. He had never been in a place that looked so mysterious like that before. This was very different from what he had imagined. Seeing their surprise, Walker then told them not to be nervous, and invited them to move. Gates are usually formed in locations far from the habitat of monsters, so they should be safe at this time. They can't use the same gate to get out, so they have to find another gate first. But when they were about to move to explore the gate, the girl suddenly felt something and looked back. There was a monster that pounced towards her by opening its mouth wide. The girl really couldn't react to the sudden attack of the monster, and could only watch herself being eaten by the monster. They were then shocked to see it. They were also confused why there were monsters here. They then worriedly called the name of the girl named Charlotte. After eating Charlotte, the monster then turned his gaze towards them, and not just one monster. It turned out that there were many of them who were now staring at them with a look of wanting to eat them. They were then frightened to see that. Walker then tried to calm down and prepare his arrows. He then cast the fire arrow skill and aimed it at the monsters. He then released the arrow towards the monster that attacked Charlotte earlier. He felt something was wrong, then told them to tie the bait to the tree. They had to get out of here. Hearing that, one of the slaves then anxiously asked to take him with them. They of course refused and told him to shut up and do as they said, while Raymond himself was now tying the chain to the tree, then tied the chain to the slaves. Seeing them who were running away with the pursuing monsters, one of the slaves then felt frightened and asked them not to leave them. But they certainly didn't care about that, and with all their might escaped from the pursuit of the monsters while carrying Charlotte's body. Seeing the monsters coming, One of the slaves could then only resignedly let himself be killed by monsters, because the chain that tied him to the tree did not allow him to escape, while the other slave just stared blankly at him, until finally a monster then attacked him. When the monsters were finishing off the slaves, they were seen running fast to get away from there. Their raid really failed this time. Cleaning it up was not important. They had to find a gate out immediately. Seeing Raymond, who was panting with a heart full of fear, Walker then told him to calm down. Seeing him, who never calmed down, Taran then held his collar and shouted at him to tell him to calm down. He also told him to listen to what Walker said. They did fail this time, but they could always prepare for another one. So he told him not to give up and focus on this moment. He was very confident that they would make it out of here, but what Taran didn't know was, there was a monster behind him with the monster's hand right above him. Right after that, the monster then flattened Taran to the ground. Seeing that, Walker then worriedly called his name. But unfortunately his worries could not be heard by the dead Taran. Raymond was very scared when he saw it, while Walker himself was very angry to see his friends die one by one. He then cast fire arrow and aimed it at the monster, but before he could even release the shot, the monster then stuck out his long tongue, and wrapped it around Walker's neck to strangle him, then dragged Walker into his mouth. After that, only Walker's screams were heard. Raymond felt an overwhelming fear when he saw the scene. His body became stiff and trembled with fear, and when he saw the monster slowly approaching him, he then desperately dragged his body to get out of there, but his efforts seemed to be in vain, because the monster could quickly approach and pounce on him. Raymond then screamed in pain due to the lower part of his body being eaten, and in the midst of his despair, he suddenly heard the sound of footsteps. A Pira then appeared in front of him. He was then surprised to find out that the man was one of the slaves that his party bought to be used as bait. He did not expect that he was still alive. He was then very happy and asked him to help him. All members of his party were dead. Only the two of them were left. He said that he was very sorry about just now. He didn't mean it. He also said to him, he shouldn't get out of here alone. It's better to have more people. So, he then once again asked him for help. But the man looked indifferent when he heard his request for help. Seeing that, Raymond then shouted at him. He told him to help him instead of just looking at him. Hearing his desperate cry, the man just smiled. He then landed in front of him. While looking at Raymond, who was slowly being eaten by the monster, the man just said, "It looks like he was too late." Raymond really felt desperate when he heard that, but he then laughed. He didn't expect help from him anymore. He asked the man, did he think he could get out of here? He then swore at him so that he would be eaten by the monster next. That was the last word from Raymond. After eating Raymond's body, the monster then looked at the man. The man was already prepared to face him. By taking a stand, the monster then accelerated quickly towards the man. Seeing the monster, who opened his mouth wide wanting to eat him, the man did not feel afraid at all. His eyes were very calm, like he was not facing a ferocious monster at all. While preparing his spear, the man then answered Raymond's dead words. He would not die, and he then thrust his spear forward, which managed to perforate the monster's body. He really killed the monster with one attack. While grabbing his hair, the man continued, the place he would die was not here. Monsters flying towards them, and in the middle of the monsters, there was a three-headed monster with a very large size. It was the Dragon King, Gornhail. Seeing that, his colleague then said, she felt that the centaur nest had collapsed. There was nothing else they could rely on now. Cygnus Knight, Resistance, Cross Hunter, all adventurers, and the 6 heroes that people saw as their glimmer of hope, have all died. Only he is the only one left, the last adventurer, Paume. Hearing that, he then looked back towards his colleagues who were standing behind him. He then invited his colleagues to fight against the monsters. This was their last adventure. Just as he said that, the Dragon King then arrived in front of them while opening one of its mouths wide. Their fight against the Dragon King was really very fierce. Paume looked badly injured with blood flowing from his head, and his colleagues, who was now lying on the ground as a corpse. Seeing one of the Dragon King's heads in front of him, Paume felt what was called despair. He wondered if this was the end, although they managed to cut off one of the Dragon King's heads, but it was all in vain, because the Dragon King still had 2 heads left. The Dragon King could also regenerate its head that he had cut off, so their efforts were completely in vain. While regenerating its head, the Dragon King then attacked him again. Seeing that, he then closed his eyes. This was the end of his fate, the end of the world, and the end of their adventure. But when the Dragon King's attack landed, he then quickly dodged. He regained his spirit. He was very unwilling, as if this was how everything ended. He then recalled the scene when his colleagues died, Philip who died from being hit by the Dragon King, Jaden whose death lay limp on the ground while saying his last words to him, and Alexis who died because she sacrificed herself to save him. Everyone has sacrificed themselves. He then screamed at the top of his lungs. He couldn't accept this. He then bent down and looked at the Dragon King with hatred. He didn't want to believe it would end like this. He then cast his magic once more. A stream of magic was created which then formed a sort of arrow. Whatever happens, he will. But before he could unleash his attack, the magic casting then failed. He also suffered a side effect, which made him spout blood from his mouth. It aggravated his wound. As Paume's wound worsened, the Dragon King then took out Dragon's breath and sprayed it towards him. He looked as small as an ant when compared to the Dragon's breath. He really felt unwilling. Why did it have to end like this? If only he was stronger, if he had one more chance. In the midst of his regret, he was then surprised when a bucket of water poured over his body. A man then told him that pretending to be sick would not work. Paume could only be confused by the situation. The man said he had to know his place as a slave. He was then surprised to hear that. He was also confused about what happened to Gornhale and why he was still alive. But he then soon realized something. As he looked around, he then faintly heard a voice talking about the slaves who were placed in the same cell as him. By looking at the handcuffs that were now locking his hands, and seeing the large number of people who came to buy slaves, he then concluded that this was a slave market. He really couldn't believe it, because as far as he remembered, the slave market had long been abolished, but this place was definitely a slave market. And that merchant, if memory serves, he was the merchant in charge of him 6 years ago when he was still a slave. When he saw him once again to make sure, he was then sure that they were the same person. The merchant was annoyed to see him glaring at him. In the middle of the merchant's fist flying towards him, he then realized that he had gone back in time, and finally the merchant's fist landed right on his face. That day, he was taken back to the starting point of all stories, with a bloody nose from the blow from the merchant. He then wondered if he was dreaming, but he immediately denied the notion. This was too realistic. He couldn't believe it. But there was no other explanation. He then saw Walker's party who was looking for slaves to be used as bait. The merchant recommended the slaves in the same cell as him to them. Walker said he would take 2 slaves. Seeing that, he thought, there is no reason to think too much about it. This was his second chance. Ending his flashback, Paume then picked up the dead Walker's staff. He knew it was the staff for fire arrow. It was not a bad skill. It was also perfect for his current skill level. But this was not enough. An adventurer must have more than a weapon, otherwise, there was no point in coming back here. But when he saw a severed leg in front of him, he then realized something. There were some people who hid their precious bears in their shoes. And when he searched inside the shoes, he then found a ring, and when he put the ring on his finger, he was then surprised to find out that it was a telekinesis ring. But while he was happy because he got a good item, he then looked back because he felt something. He saw the monsters that had now caught up and were behind him. Seeing that, he wondered if they smelled blood, not giving him time to think further. The monsters then immediately rushed to attack him, but he was able to finish the invading monsters quite easily. But he was then surprised when he saw the monster stick out its long tongue and wrapped it around his spear. After that, the monster then destroyed his spear using the twist of its tongue. A look of disbelief could be clearly seen on Paume's face when he saw that. In the midst of his shock, the monster then pounced towards his while opening its mouth wide. Regaining his composure, Paume then cast a fire arrow, and released it towards the monster that pounced on him. He also thought of testing the ring he had just got too. After the fire arrow penetrated the monster's body, Paume then moved its trajectory using telekinesis magic. He used the fire arrow to penetrate the bodies of the monsters around him, until finally the fire arrow was extinguished, although it didn't last too long, but it killed quite a lot of monsters. Seeing the remaining monsters, Paume thought it didn't matter, but he was then surprised when the staff suddenly couldn't release the fire arrow anymore. He then immediately rushed to avoid when the monsters pounced on him. He was confused. The staff didn't seem to be damaged. Was it a cooldown? The monsters really didn't give him time to rest, because when Paume just got alone, the other monsters immediately pounced towards him. But fortunately he could finish the monster even though he only had a staff. It left him no choice. He then attacked the monster using the staff repeatedly. then kicked the monster, making the monster fall. While fighting, he also wondered when the cooldown on the staff was over, and shortly after that, the staff then turned on again. Seeing the monsters who were together attacking towards him, Paume was not at all afraid. He then returned to casting the fire arrow, and once again controlled its trajectory using the ring, and the fire arrow once again carried out its massacre. Paume just indifferently looked at the corpses of the monsters that had gaping holes in their stomachs. When Paume finished finishing off all the monsters, suddenly a voice was heard from someone. It was a girl named Charlotte from Raymond's party. She suddenly said to him, "You are not an ordinary slave." Paume then turned to her when he heard that. He was also quite surprised to see her alive, expert in using spears and also magic. Charlotte then asked who he was. Seeing her alive, Paume thought that she was lucky, but he then felt that unlucky was a better word to describe Charlotte's situation. Seeing him still not talking, Charlotte then asked again, why he had the staff, and the one on his wrist. She hysterically asked how a slave like him could awaken, and as she looked around her, towards the corpses of her colleagues, she then guessed that this was all his plan. Hearing that, Paume just looked at her with an apathetic look. In the midst of the silence, he then asked if she had finished speaking. Charlotte was then confused to hear that. Paume then said that she had misunderstood, but that did not mean that things would be different. Even if he planned this, he would also kill them all. Charlotte was then angry to hear that, but she was then horrified when she saw Paume pointing his staff at her, while saying that he really hated people like her who used slaves as bait. After leaving the gate, Paume then returned to the port city of Lith. The residents there were very surprised when they saw him. They did not expect that he who was a bait slave had returned alone. Paume did not care about them at all and thought the dice had been rolled. He had to hurry up to avoid repeating the same fate. Then first, while looking at the building in front of him, he then thought that he had to free himself first. Inside the building that Paume was going to visit, there was a person who was reporting to his boss about a slave who returned alive. His boss was named Abby's. His subordinate said it seemed that he returned unharmed at all. Although his subordinate said so, but Abby's was confused why it was a problem. It was not unusual for people who served as bait to return unharmed. Hearing his confusion, his subordinate explained, all the adventurers who were with him died in the dungeon. Abby's was then shocked to hear that. He then asked to confirm, so was he the only one who managed to survive? He also found it strange. Besides, he did not escape, and returned on his own. People who became slaves due to debt would end up as bait again even if they returned alive. Even so, he did not escape, meaning that he understands that it is impossible for him to escape from them easily, because the only way to escape is death. Abby's paused for a moment, then said, that's how the Gaffer Merchant Union works, right? So he then asked his subordinate, why should he receive a report about something that is not very important? On hearing that, the subordinate said that there were other events to report besides this. The slave opened a one circle. Abby's was very surprised to hear that. He was surprised to hear that the slave who was previously a bait became a one circle. He also thought, surely the slave harbored bad feelings towards the merchant union, and if the situation became chaotic. While Abby's was pondering that, the subordinate continued, plus he asked for a contract change. Abby's was then confused to hear that. The subordinate guessed that it seemed that he wanted to register as an adventurer. Abby's was really shocked to hear that. He did not expect a lowly slave to want to become an adventurer. He felt that he was really unaware of himself. In the midst of his shock, his subordinate then returned with news that surprised him. Mr. Racken told him to take care of this matter. Abby's was then shocked when he heard the name. He did not expect an executive of the Gaffer Merchant Union to be interested in a lowly slave for this reason, but he then immediately denied the allegation. With his eyes fixed on the book on his desk, he wondered what it was because of that. When his subordinate finished reporting, he then left the room. Abby's put his cigar in the ashtray, and was seen pondering while looking out the window. According to Queen Cygnus, the status of slaves is not allowed. That's what it sounds like. Humans have always been slaves for the sake of the meso. If they can't pay the money borrowed, they have to pay as labor. This idea created slaves in the Maple world. When his only family, his father, fell ill, he became one of them, black moss. A plant he bought by owing the Gaffer Merchant Union. The Merchant Guild sold the black moss at a higher price than it should be, 100,000 mesos. It made him unable to pay. He then ended up in court, and the judge's verdict for him for not being able to pay off the debt of 100,000 mesos after the specified deadline was he had to work for the merchant union in order to pay off the amount of debt. The world seemed to collapse for him when he heard the verdict. With that, he began to be exploited for 6 years under the union. Now, it was time for revenge. He came to the Gaffer merchant union and met Abis. He then introduced himself to him. He also knew Abis. He was the left hand of Rakan, one of the executive of the merchant union. He got a big catch. Abis didn't mince words and immediately asked, so, did he want to renew his contract? He had already received a report about him, so he would get to the point, put down his drinking cup. Abis then said he would change his contract to a contract for F-rank adventurers. Paume was then surprised to hear that. He didn't expect him to accept his request so easily, but after thinking about it, it was not surprising. He had expected him to be aware of it. He then thanked him, but Paume's request did not stop there. He then asked to be raised to E rank. He did not intend to follow the tide. Abis was then surprised to hear his request, because the Adventure Association had not even given him a rank. Paume only said that he had explored hundreds of gates in the past 3 years as a bait slave. Even so, Abis was still doubtful, because it was only experience as a bait. He had never killed a monster. Hearing that, Paume then asked, since when did killing monsters become a reference for adventure? Abis could only be confused. Hearing that, Paume explained, the reason the first adventurer could make a name for himself was because he survived. The reference of an adventurer was to return alive. He also thought, the problem was that the information of those who returned played a bigger role than individual achievements. Hearing that, Abis did not deny that. He was right about surviving for 3 years as a bait slave was not a simple achievement, but that was it. He had only entered a dungeon with an easy difficulty level. Abis then asked him, did he think that his life skills would help him survive in the high-level gate? He also felt that he seemed to think of them as idiots who would give risky contracts to people who would die without paying off their debts. He also thought that Paume was crazy. He just thought of Paume as someone who thought he was great, when he would die without achieving anything. Paume was silent for a moment hearing that. Seeing that, Abis then thought, even so, what a sickening feeling this is. In the midst of his silence, Paume then heard Abis who suddenly spoke. There is a gate, with only 5 people allowed to enter, and it has 12 scars. Seeing his surprise, Abis then confirmed the conjecture that might be in his head. At least, there are bones from 12 parties buried there. He then told him to prove himself to him, that he was worthy of what he was talking about, while giving him a paper containing a contract. Abis then said he would give him what he wanted. In a lush forest, Paume was seen gathering with his new party members. The leader of the party then greeted him and introduced himself. His name was Chev. His role was tank. He heard about him from Master Abis, so he knew that he was a former slave bait, but Chev said that he didn't care about something like that, so he asked Paume not to worry. His colleagues were seen welcoming him. Seeing that, Paume said, hopefully they could work well together. Seeing his sluggish look, Chev then said he heard he could use fire magic. Paume confirmed it. His colleague also looked surprised to hear that. He also asked, is that the elemental magic he can use is already determined? Hearing that, Chev then explained, he heard that mages cannot use elemental magic except for the one element they were born with, so, items that are not related to their element are useless to them. His colleague was surprised to hear Chev know about that. He also felt that it was very complicated. Chev then ended his basics. He said he was sure Paume had heard. But the purpose of the mission this time was not to hunt monsters. Their goal is to collect items from the 12 parties killed before them. Then, they just need to return the items to the merchant union. From what he heard, they would give 3,000 mesos per item. His partner felt that was too much. They would receive nothing if they didn't get the items. A one-circle adventurer item is at least 7,000 mesos. Seeing that, his other partner then told him not to complain, but he immediately denied when he was said to be complaining, seeing that they were even noisy. Chev then immediately told them to end it. He also asked if they were all ready. Let's scavenge money. And they then entered the gate. Once inside, they were then presented with an unfamiliar environment with fog everywhere. The black man felt that although this place was bright, it felt gloomy. Chev then told them not to let their guard down. There was a possibility that they would have a long-term battle in the forest. So they would build a camp first, while looking at the tree near where they were. The black man then suggested, how about in that tree, with so many branches? He thought hiding and moving to another branch would be easy. Hearing that, Chev then looked at the tree and thought it was a good idea. he then decided where they would camp, and they then took out the items that would be used to make a camp. Seeing Paume, who was silent from earlier, the black man then went to him and told him to rest. Building camps was his and his colleagues' expertise. After a while, they then finished building a simple camp on the tree. Chev said, now they would split into 2 groups to explore the surroundings. He then called his 3 colleagues named Tom, Max, and Roa respectively. He grouped the 3 of them into one group, while he himself would be with Paume. His group would go to the east and west to explore, then return. He told them to send a signal if something happened, and run straight to the camp. He then asked if they understood. They understood, and they then split up into their respective paths. While exploring for some time, Chev was confused, let alone items. They didn't even encounter even a single monster. He even wondered if they were too quick to determine the location. He also felt that it seemed that they should go deeper tomorrow. Putting that aside, he then asked Paume how his first mission as an adventurer looking. Paume said that he felt nervous. Chev chuckled at that, but it was natural. He even felt that it was natural. He then said, he had been an adventurer for a long time, but he was still nervous when entering the gate. He admitted that he was a fearful person. Even so, he was able to gain courage because there were good people by his side. Praising them might sound strange coming out of his mouth, but they were really good people. He also said that he felt sorry for him when he heard his story. Being a bait slave, he could only imagine how hard it was. Therefore, he then called Paume and said, if he doesn't mind, how about he join? But before he finished his sentence, he was then surprised when he looked back. Chev then just said that he wasn't serious about it, and asked him not to think about it. When they returned to the camp, they then both shared their findings. But the surprise was that they didn't find anything at all, but they then felt that it made sense. Because there was no way they could find the item easily. Seeing them still discussing, Chev then told them not to talk about work while eating. They could talk about it tomorrow, while Paume himself was just silent all the time. Late at night, with the towering moon illuminating the dark world, in the camp they set up, while carrying a torch in his hand, Chev's party then visited Paume, who looked asleep, and asked, was he sleeping? But there was no response from Paume to the question. Seeing him still silent, Tom then asked what he was doing, with a cruel look. He was sure that Paume was fast asleep. How could he answer him? He then came forward and said that he was too alert. He also asked if he had forgotten what they had mixed into his food. The sleeping plant could even put Mushmom, who weighed more than 100 kilograms, to sleep. He saw him eating it with gusto. He was lucky not to die immediately. He then giggled for a moment. When he saw Paume's staff, he knew that it was a fire arrow wand. It was worth at least 10,000 mesos. While taking out his dagger and pointing it at Paume, he then said, let's get to work. But when he thrust his dagger, he was then confused and surprised because he did not feel the sensation of stabbing a human body, and when he removed the blanket covering the bed, they were then surprised because they did not see Paume there, and it turned out to be a trick. Chev then immediately told them to look for him. He was sure he must not be far from here, but he was then surprised when an explosion suddenly erupted in their camp. The place had now been devoured by fire, and Paume, as the culprit of the incident, was just watching silently. They were still confused about what happened, why the fire suddenly broke out. Chev then ordered them to quickly secure food and goods. He also wondered if it was Paume, but he was then confused when Max suddenly called out to him while pointing in a direction, and when he looked in the direction he was pointing, he then saw a slimy monster that had a very large size with eyes that could be the size of an adult human. Chev was very horrified when he saw it. He also cursed Paume, knowing that they had been used as bait by him. Seeing the monster that opened its mouth wide, they then immediately rushed to escape from there. The attack from the monster was able to knock down the camp they built with just one attack by relying on its size alone. Paume, who saw that, then called them lousy. They shouldn't be too kind if they wanted to trap it. At the gate that even more than 12 parties that had veteran adventurers failed to clear it. But they even welcomed a former slave bait like him. Obviously they were planning something. Looking at the monster that was now chasing Chev's party, Paume then knew, so the boss monster of this area was it. He had already guessed that the boss was that creature, but its size was bigger than he expected. As they were chased by the monster, Chev then cursed. He knew about the monster. This type of creature was difficult for them to handle. Hearing that, Max then asked if he knew what kind of creature it was. Chev said, if his guess was right, then it was a gold slime. It was not something normally found in the maple world. It was a rare monster boss that only appeared from the Red Gate. The creature's body was acidic, so it was the worst opponent for adventurers like them, and the most dangerous. But before he could finish his sentence, he then felt something from behind him. He then immediately told them to dodge. It was seen that the creature was shooting acidic liquid towards them. But fortunately the attack could be avoided by them because Chev's intuition was quite good. Seeing that, Max then horrifiedly asked what it was. He was surprised because the creature had a long-range attack. Chev then explained. It was Acid Arrow, a skill that made it spray acid in its body. Max was horrified to hear that. He then asked if it wasn't too strong a skill. Chev didn't answer his question and told them to be alert. It attacked again, while fleeing from the Golden Slime's attack. They then asked him what they should do. Was there any way they could deal with it? Hearing that, Chev replied, first they had to leave here immediately. The Acid Arrow cooldown period was only 1 minute. They would stay away and find a way to fight it. They have to target the core inside his head. Hearing that the Golden Slime skill is still in the Cold One period, Tom then grinned while looking back. He then suddenly rushed back towards the Golden Slime. They were then surprised to see that. Tom said they still had time, and told them to leave it to him. Seeing Tom, who was desperately facing the Golden Slime alone, Chev then tried to stop him. They had to attack him together, but it was in vain. Because Tom was too close to the Golden Slime and was hit by its Acid Arrow skill which made his body split into two, Chev was then shocked to see that. He was shocked because there should still be about 10 seconds before his skill could be used again. Not giving him time to think, the Golden Slime then sprayed acid towards him. It really made his death so terrible with only his bones left. Seeing that, Paume then thought, it seemed to be over. He also thought that Chev's words were not wrong, but, after the Golden Slime ate the item, he would become stronger. He thought that the cooldown period of his skill was reduced after he became stronger, abnormal size and Acid Arrow skill with short cooldown duration. Now he knew the reason why all the groups that came here failed and ended up dead. The creature was too difficult for them to overcome. It had grown so much that it was probably in the category of Yellow Gate monsters, 2 levels above Red Gate. It was no longer a monster that one circle adventurers could overcome. He was also sure that there were not many items left in this dungeon. It seemed that this mission had failed. He then remembered Abby's look when he handed him the contract while telling him to prove herself. He was silent for a moment when he remembered that, and as he continued to watch the slime then seemed to realize his existence. But before the slime could attack him, Paume had first attacked it using a fire arrow that made the upper half of its body destroyed. The destroyed part of his body then spurted everywhere which made the ground around it crumble due to the acidic liquid, but his attack seemed to be in vain. Because the slime could quickly regenerate the destroyed part of its body. Seeing that, Paume then wondered if it had magic resistance. He was sure he had aimed at the core in its head. He felt that the monster was not bad, but with 4 more shots. But when he looked back at the slime state, he then corrected his words. He needed at least 5 more shots, but he felt that it didn't matter. With a confident smile, Paume said he would prove it to him, after the cooldown of its skill was over. The slime then fired an acid arrow at him. Seeing that, Paume then immediately moved to avoid it. The acid attack was really very powerful because it could penetrate trees like through mud. Paume did his best not to be hit by the acid. He swung around using a rope to which he tied a dagger. He was a bit overwhelmed because of how much Acid Arrow was. He then controlled the rope using the telekinesis ring, and made the dagger at the end of the rope stick in one of the trees nearby. He had to hit the same point without missing a bit. An ordinary mage would not think of doing something like this, but he was not an ordinary mage. One of the titles he had in his previous life was the best telekinetic. He really did not disappoint his reputation. He looked very skillful in avoiding the acidic liquid shot from the slime using the rope which he controlled using the telekinesis ring. After the cooldown of the staff ended, he then took a suitable angle, and fired fire arrow towards the slime. Now he only needed to fire 4 more fire arrow shots towards the slime to defeat it as he had predicted at the beginning, but the slime certainly would not just stand by and let itself be defeated. It then fired another acid arrow towards him. Seeing that, Paume then swung using the rope that he had stuck to the tree, then quickly climbed the tree. The acid arrow shot almost hit him. After the skill cooldown was over, he then returned to casting fire arrow, and fired it at the slime. Now it only took 3 more. The battle was really very fierce. After the slime was hit by his fire arrow, it then returned to showering him with acid arrows which Paume then managed to avoid with difficulty. And after the skill cooldown ended, he then returned to firing fire arrows at the slime, but unfortunately the shot was successfully avoided by it. Paume was then surprised to see that, despite its size, it turned out to be quite agile too, but it was useless. Paume then changed the trajectory of the fire arrow that was avoided by the slime, which then strongly hit the slime. After being attacked repeatedly at the same point, the core of the slime then revealed itself. Seeing that, not thinking much, Paume then immediately rushed to destroy it. This was the final attack. When Paume was preparing for his final attack, the slime then formed a kind of hand and tried to attack him using its huge hand. The huge hand of the golden slime completely covered the sky above it. Seeing that, he then used the telekinesis ring again, to distance himself from there by pulling himself towards the dagger that he had stuck on the ground nearby. Fortunately Paume was able to react quickly, otherwise he might have died from the slime's attack. After landing on the ground, he then cast the fire arrow again, and released it towards the golden slime. The golden slime looked panicked when it saw it, and tried to protect its head using its hands. Paume just grinned when he saw its efforts. He then changed the trajectory of the fire arrow and made it ignore the slime's hands and go straight to its head. The fire arrow then hit right on the golden arrow's head, and made the core in its head break. With its core now broken, the slime's body suddenly bubbled up. Panic could be seen clearly in the slime's eyes as it faced the last moment of its life, and the slime then exploded, which caused a very powerful explosion effect around. Paume, who saw it, then immediately ran from there. With the explosion of the golden slime's body, the liquid produced by his body then flowed flooding around. The liquid even looked like chasing Paume. Knowing that he would drown in the acidic liquid if he only relied on his legs to run, Paume then once again utilized his telekinesis magic. He then threw his rope far ahead, which he then controlled to wrap around the tree branch in front of him. Paume then immediately climbed the tree branch by relying on his rope. That made him successfully avoid the acid that flooded the area. Feeling that he had successfully avoided the crisis, he then looked down. The scene he saw looked like a river formed by acid. The impact of the flood of acid really made the surrounding environment destroyed. After the effects of the acid subsided, Paume then landed back on the ground. While he was moving forward, he then felt something. Something was seen with a red light burning in front of him. He then immediately picked it up. Using the telekinesis magic, the object looked like a small red ball. The red ball then suddenly lit up brightly, then seemed to be about to release something. Right after that, a red barrier then enveloped his surroundings. After he left the dungeon, he then returned to visit Abby's. Seeing him back alive, Abby's was silent for a moment. He then admitted that he was not just a big mouth, but he asked why he came back alone again, and without the items he was supposed to take. Hearing that, Paume explained. The group he gave was the new hunters. They tried to steal all his items. When he left the group, they met the boss monster and it seemed like they all died. Even though he said so, but Abby still looked suspicious, until finally he then heard from him that the monster they fought was a golden slime. If their opponent was a golden slime, Abby's knew all the items in the dungeon would definitely disappear. Paume confirmed it. Hearing that, Abby's then cursed in his heart. He was upset that all the items of the rented merchant union were also destroyed. This was a loss that he could not just let go, and the problem was that he managed to get out safely. There are some general rules on the gate. First, there is a limit to how many people can enter. The people who can enter must match the number on the gate pillar, and after that, the gate will be inactive until everyone inside is killed. Second, there are restrictions on who can enter based on the gate difficulty level and circle level. The gate difficulty level is divided based on its color, ranging from red gate to purple gate, and those who have a circle higher than the gate difficulty level will not be able to enter. Third, there is only one chance to raid the gate. That was the biggest hurdle when targeting a gate, and if someone who entered managed to survive and exit, the gate would be destroyed and could not be entered anymore. So if the adventurers who entered the gate did not die, then there was no other chance. He now knew that the gate was destroyed. He also understood why many party adventurers died there. The golden slime was indeed too difficult for one Crikel adventurers to deal with. Now that he knew the cause, he then didn't mind Paume returning alone. And since all the items there had disappeared, then he understood the reason for not bringing anything back. But whatever the reason, the fact is that he still failed. Paume was silent for a moment hearing that. He then said that he had not finished explaining. Abby's was then confused to hear that. Paume then untied the clothes on his wrist, while showing his wrist which now had 2 circles. He then said that he had defeated the golden slime. Abby's was then surprised to see that. He did not expect that Paume would become a second Crikel so quickly. He then asked if he absorbed the mana stone from the golden slime. Paume did not answer and said, he thought this was enough to prove himself, as promised. He then asked him to give him E rank. But he was then confused and surprised when he heard Abby's say D rank. Abby's then said he would give him D rank. Not only that, if he cooperated with him, he would treat him like a C rank adventurer, and he would then give him the contract. After reading the contract for a moment, Paume signed it. Normally, giving someone who wasn't even a third circle adventurer the title of C rank would be considered an overreaction. An adventurer's rank was greatly influenced by the circle. There were 3 levels in the adventurer's pyramid, with new adventurers covering F to E rank adventurers, junior adventurers covering D to C rank adventurers, and veteran adventurers covering B to A rank. The circle indicated strength. The difference was quite clear, but he felt that this Paume was abnormal. Normally you couldn't increase the circle just by using mana stones. He then remembered her saying about survival instinct. He wondered what it was because of that. Abby's thought he did have it, survival instinct. More precisely an extraordinary talent, someone who had just become first circle. Then without a long time back as second circle, he had never seen such speed before. He need him. Abby's then tried to put a friendly smile on his face. Paume could only be silent at that. He then sighed. His treatment increased faster than he expected. It seemed he was quite impatient. There was not much time left. First red rank, 100-member gate raid. A big event that is currently being watched by the Lithport Merchant Union and the guilds. Of course, the Gaffer Merchant Union must also be quite interested in the event. Well, there is nothing wrong with accepting his offer. He is also in a hurry. Maybe it's even a good thing to help his plans. He then said to him that he had a request. Hearing that, Abby's then asked what the request was, while stretching out his hand towards him. Paume asked, please lend him money. Abby's was stunned for a moment hearing that. He then resentfully cursed him silently. Some say that the gate is what started the era of adventurers, but it was all a trap of the black magician. Many adventurers died in the gate, thus killing the potential future of the Maple World. Then, the final day came. All the monsters who had been waiting for the time to come finally came out of the gate. Facing that, they were defeated. Exactly 3 years from now, the fate that would befall the Maple World would soon happen. After their negotiations ended, Paume left, while smoking a cigar. Abby's then looked out the window, watching Paume who was now walking away, although not enough. Paume felt that this should be good enough to be able to start. The 100-member gate found this time was a red level. Only the second circle and above could enter it. Usually, the Gaffer Trade Union only chose adventurers with high circles. The reason why they invested in the second circle seemed to be because the Gaffer Trade Union was eyeing the gate. He did earn some money, but spending it all on items was foolish. Items that matched his level would definitely be very expensive. If he wanted to spend the money efficiently, then, based on that thought, he then came to a place. When he saw the sign above the entrance with the world's lettering on it, Paume paused for a moment, and when he went inside, he was greeted by a man. The place turned out to be a slave market in the city of Portlith. When he saw Paume's clothes, the man suspected that he was an adventurer. He then said he would guide him. He asked, what kind of slave was he looking for, whether it was bait for the dungeon, or a warrior who could fight by his side. Hearing that, Paume said that he was looking for someone, and asked the man to guide him. The man could only be confused and surprised to hear that. He then led him into the punishment room. He explained, they used this place to punish those who were troublemakers, like the person he was looking for. They then arrived in front of one of the cells there, and finally saw the person Paume was looking for. Seeing the person who was firmly chained in his cell, the man then swallowed his saliva. He hesitantly asked, was he sure it was him? Paume confirmed it. While looking at the person, Paume said that he was the person he was looking for. Seeing the two of them standing in front of his cell, the man then stared at the two of them with a ferocious gaze. Before he regressed, there was an incident where someone's death hastened the end of the Maple World. The polearm hero, Aaron, that girl was killed, the first and last student of Aaron, the person who started the beginning of the end of the Maple World, the hero killer, Debois, who was now standing right in front of him. Debois then asked if he had come looking for him. He didn't know him, so he then told him to get out of there. Seeing that, the man then apologized to him. His mental state was indeed somewhat. Paume actually didn't care too much about it. although his nature was different from before his regression. Now he was just a slave, acting like that to an adventurer even though he was a slave, was really out of line. The man then said to reassure him, "There are no more mad dogs like him here," but Paume grinned, not only personality, but also skills, along with him. He was one of the few people who got the spotlight after the end of the world. They were often compared because they came from the same region, rose at the same time, and had similar abilities, but the most similar thing was, Paume then asked how much the price was. Hearing that, Dubois felt like he was a young master from a rich family. He then asked if he could pay the price he asked. He put the price at 1,000,000 pesos. While grinning, he then asked if it was okay for him. Hearing that, Paume thought, they both needed money. He had a younger sister who was suffering from black blood disease. Seeing him who did not answer, Dubois then told him to leave if he did not have money, but he was then surprised. When he saw Paume take out 1,000,000 pesos from his pocket, he was very surprised when he saw that much money. He then asked if it was real money. He suspected that it was fake. The man was also surprised when he saw it. Dubois then removed the grin on his face and became silent. He seemed to really need the money, Paume said. Before that, he had to listen to him first. The contract period was 1 year with a profit distribution of 7-3. He had the right to choose the drop item first at the gate. The man was then surprised to hear that. He asked if he wanted to make a contract as a party member and not as a slave. Paume then handed the contract to Dubois and told him to look at it first. Seeing that, Dubois then immediately took the contract. He didn't even read it and quickly said that he agreed. He seemed to be afraid that Paume would change his mind. He then bit his finger to make it bleed, and dripped his blood on the contract paper. He accepted it without hesitation. Paume asked if it was because his sister's life was in danger. Seeing that the agreement had been successful, he then smiled happily. He then said to him, since the contract had been made, they would go straight to the gate. Hearing that, with a confident smile, Dubois then told him to leave it to him. Seeing his confidence, Paume then told him that he had to prove his worth. Dubois said that he would work harder than anyone he had ever met. After that, they then walked to the gate. When they were about to go inside, Dubois then hesitantly said, he was grateful that he had bought him a new weapon. But usually he used a long sword. They had to go back to exchange it. Hearing that, Paume then said, from now on, he will use the polearm while working with him. If he doesn't like it, they can end the contract. Dubois was then surprised to hear that. He then did not question it anymore. Looking in front of them, Dubois then asked if this was the gate he would use to test it. Red level, 1 claw and an entry limit of 8 people. It seemed like the right place. Dubois then asked who the other party members were. He thought that Paume was rich, so he was sure that the party members must be great. He also guessed that there must be a healer too, but before he finished his sentence, he was confused when he saw Paume looking at him with a strange look. He then realized something. He then asked him not to worry about the party members. They had enough people. He sighed. He had guessed that his fear was in vain. Seeing that, Paume then pointed at him, and said, you are the one. Dubois was stunned for a moment hearing that. He was then shocked and was about to question him, but Paume told him not to waste time, and invited him to enter. He then forcibly put Dubois into the gate by kicking him. Right after that, they arrived at the gate. Dubois fell down as he entered the gate. Ignoring his embarrassing position, he then asked if he was crazy. He questioned his decision regarding entering the gate of 8 people with only 2 people. He looked very upset. Crazy also has a limit. Did he take this as a joke? Added to that, he also had to use a weapon that he had not yet mastered. Paume just stared at him silently at his annoyance. But they were then surprised when they saw a lot of monsters that had the shape of felled trees moving towards them. Dubois immediately became alarmed at that. He knew he had messed up by shouting earlier. He also knew that monsters, they were known to have bark that was difficult for swords and spears to penetrate, not to mention their large numbers. But when he was getting ready to face the monsters, Paume suddenly told him to step aside. Dubois was then surprised and tried to stop him, who seemed to want to go forward alone. Ignoring his surprise, Paume then cast a fire arrow and fired it at the monsters. The fire arrow could easily burn the tree-shaped monster. Dubois was then surprised to see that. Not stopping there, Paume then moved the trajectory of the fire arrow using the telekinesis ring, and made it slaughter the monsters. Fire might really be the best counter for tree-type monsters, because just by hitting it once with the fire arrow, it was able to kill the monster. Paume then said that he was really disappointed. He didn't expect him to behave like that once they entered the gate. He then asked him not to make that kind of mistake again, seeing him able to slaughter the monsters so easily. Dibwa then asked who this monster really was. At night, when the full moon was clearly visible in the sky, in a building, a woman was seen respectfully reporting something to her boss. She reported, the merchants had eaten the bait, they were still arranging the time to execute the plan, but the people to be sent had already been determined. Hearing the report, her boss was silent while playing with his wine cup. Seeing his silence, the woman then asked, would he allow her to continue with this plan? Hearing that, her boss said yes. Hearing his confirmation, the woman then respectfully bowed, and left there. Seeing that, he thought, everything will go according to that person's wishes. With a gesture as if to toast the moon, he then said, freedom to the maple world.